Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show, bringing you another really fascinating guest today involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Emily Osborne, who's a research scientist in the Ocean Chemistry and Ecosystems Division at the Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory. And their organization is a federal laboratory. It's part of NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, located down in Miami. And their research focus spans everything from tropical cyclone and hurricane studies to coastal ecosystems, ocean and human health, climate studies, global carbon systems, and ocean observations. And it is one of the seven NOAA Research Laboratories. With a bachelor's in geology from College of Charleston and a Ph.D. in marine sciences from the University of South Carolina, Dr. Osborne is currently involved in investigating both regional and global biogeochemical issues related to ocean health, as well as climate, through the use of a combination of tools, including paleoceanographic approaches, new autonomous sensing technologies, as well as conventional measurement tools on these interesting, large, multi-disciplinary oceanographic cruises. A lot of interesting topics that we have not delved into on previous shows. Very excited. Dr. Emily Osborne, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a really an exciting set of topics that we have not really spent much time on. I would love to start off, though, as we typically do, by handing you the floor for a little bit, just to talk a little bit more about you. If you could take us a little into, the background, everything from where you grew up, a little bit of when you first developed these intellectual interests in not just geology, but marine sciences, of course, and a little bit of that early journey. I think that'd be a great way to set the stage on everything we're going to be going into.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm originally from Northern Virginia and have spent most of my kind of adult years traveling around. So home has changed from South Carolina back to Washington, D.C., and now down in Florida, living in Miami. But I grew up going hiking with my dad in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and just kind of from an early age was really interested in the world around me. And climate change came on to my radar as something that I felt really passionate about, trying to kind of make a difference and make the world have a better tomorrow, I think, as you said in your introduction. And so I found myself wanting to pursue environmental science and found a really great mentor at the College of Charleston who brought me into geology. And so from the lens of thinking about Earth's past, we can kind of contextualize how different our climate is today. And from there, I decided to go on to graduate school and initially started in a master's program at the University of South Carolina, and just was so excited about the work I was doing. I wrote a proposal that was entirely too large for a master's and switched degree tracks and did a PhD instead. And even when I was working on my undergraduate degree in geology at the College of Charleston, it was always with a flavor of what's the geology of the ocean and what the fossil record on the seafloor can tell us about the earth around us. And so it was natural for me to kind of move into a marine science degree, still thinking about the way that the geologic record in the ocean is a tool that can help us kind of understand the past as the key to the future. And so, yeah, and I've continued throughout my career to kind of morph and take on new unknown fields of research. And even most recently with this position that I took at AOML, the lab that I'm working at now, I am moving into modern oceanography and using sensor technology. And I'm really trying to blend all the different tools and backgrounds and disciplines that I've kind of picked up along the way to continue to answer and ask new questions about how the oceans and our climate are changing.
Excellent. And yeah, I mean and we'll get into sort of the breadth of everything that goes on in the group at NOAA, sort of broadly in sort of biogeochemistry. But your PhD and sort of the work you did back then specifically focused on a very interesting. I spent my time sort of reading up on foraminifera, but a sort of very specific area of this fossil geologic record. Your PhD was entitled "The Development and Application of Foraminiferal Carbonate System Proxies to Quantify Ocean Acidification in the California Current." And here we have this really interesting set of single-cell organisms that there's a lot of them. They produce a tremendous amount of calcium. Millions of tons every year, and ocean acidification dissolves all that, and they're a really great sort of bioindicator proxy to see what's going on. Take us a little into this part. I simplified it there a little too much, probably. Take us a little bit into your PhD work, specifically on this interesting living proxy for ocean acidification.
Sure. No, I think that was a great synopsis, maybe even better than one that I could deliver myself. But essentially, yeah, my PhD was really focused on using these organisms that, as you mentioned, are called foraminifera, or I call them forams for short. And forams can either live in the surface of the ocean or on the bottom of the ocean on the seafloor. And because I have always been interested in understanding the way that our anthropogenic human-produced CO2 emissions are affecting our climate and our oceans, it was natural for me to gravitate towards studying the forams that live in the surface of the ocean. So they're called planktonic foraminifera. So there are a number of different species that live in the surface ocean. Each species kind of has its own habitat within the water column, whether they live in the polar ocean or if they like to live in the tropics. And so I kind of honed in on a couple of species that were in my particular study area and was using their shells, which are fossilized remains that sink to the seafloor once they die, and they're preserved on the seafloor. And so they are effectively our fossil record that we can tap into to try to understand what the oceans were like when they were alive. Planktonic forams live for about a month at a time. They actually, we think, live on a lunar cycle. And so the fact that they're living for such a short period of time means that they really represent a pretty tight snapshot in terms of they've grown their shells in equilibrium with the seawater that's around them. And in the process, they're capturing kind of the different chemical elements that are in the seawater around them. And then that tiny shell is kind of locked in and it sinks to the seafloor, and we can find them on the seafloor and use them as a tool to understand what the ocean has been like in the past. The reason that has had a lot of importance to my work in trying to understand what the last kind of 100 years or so have looked like is because kind of the other CO2 problem, we call it, is ocean acidification. So this is the process by which the oceans are absorbing atmospheric CO2 as CO2 is going up in the atmosphere. About a quarter of our CO2 emissions are getting soaked up by the surface of the ocean. And as the ocean does that, it's fundamentally changing the chemistry. And by kind of definition, the chemistry is dropping in terms of its pH. And so this is a process that's called ocean acidification. It's been really well documented by ocean observations, but we've only really known about it for about 20 or 30 years. And we know that we've been emitting CO2 for much longer than the last 20 or 30 years. And so these forams come in as a tool for us to supplement our modern observations so that we can look at their shells and use the shells as a means to estimate what the ocean chemistry has been like in the past. And so I was using them as a proxy, we call it, for ocean acidification and pH conditions in the surface ocean.
And just to compare that, just I'm sorry, I don't mean to make you give us a lecture, but I think it's pretty cool. Usually when there's an article in sort of the popular press about ocean acidification, you usually see some scuba divers swimming around the coral reef, and there's some problems here. But clearly you just described why your system, the rapid life cycle and so forth, and the reefs, and we'll get into sort of your broad mission there. Has a reef sort of initiative as well. I mean, are they both useful tools, or I mean, in the sense of, once again, sort of this, the oceans are acidifying and they're doing all sorts of bad stuff. Just say a couple words, compare sort of why we may look at certain systems versus others in the case of, the beautiful coral reefs versus the little guys that we don't always see at the bottom of it.
Yeah, and I guess I should have mentioned too that forams are about the size of a grain of sand, so they are very small, but as you go and swim around in the ocean, they are around you and they are on the seafloor. One of the perks to working with forams, you mentioned already, is the fact that it has this really short life cycle. It dies and it sinks to the seafloor. So we're just working with kind of fossil remains of organisms. In terms of coral research, they are definitely kind of an excellent gateway for us to really communicate the effects of ocean acidification. So corals are being impacted by warming, by ocean acidification, by nutrient runoff. So there's lots of different stressors that are affecting these complex organisms and ecosystems. So they really help us to kind of demonstrate the impacts that climate change and ocean acidification has on our ecosystems. Excellent. Forams are an excellent kind of simple, basic tool or proxy, if you will. Forams are not dying because of ocean acidification. We're not seeing the populations of forams being decimated. The effects that we're seeing on forams is that their shells are thinning as a result of ocean acidification. It doesn't mean that their livelihood is in jeopardy. That's not to say that we could kind of hit a tipping point and pH is too low for a particular species at a particular time. It gets shocked. I'm not saying that couldn't happen in the future, but that wasn't really the central kind of focus of my work. I was looking to develop a tool that could be used as kind of an indicator of, And so essentially, even across a season, so the particular part of the ocean I was working in, we saw really strong seasonal changes in pH that are natural. So the west coast of California has natural upwelling that happens as a result of wind blowing along the coast. And so we have this really dynamic kind of pH that occurs just across a single year. And because of that, even just across a year, I could clearly see when I looked at these fine scale details of the shells, which we haven't talked about how I do that yet, but you could see that the shells are physically thinning and thickening over the course of even just a season. So they're really responsive to their environment, and we can use like quantitatively that change in shell thickness to say what the pH was like in the condition that they grew in.
Excellent. Excellent. I appreciate you educating on that. Perfect. So, okay. So then let's head into your specific group. It's the Ocean Chemistry and Ecosystems Division. And again, a rather broad purview here, as mentioned, coral reefs, carbon dioxide monitoring, ecosystem restoration. We had a couple of years ago Frank Marks from the Hurricane Division on talking about flying through hurricanes and stuff like that. You don't do that stuff, but you're on some cool boats. Introduce us to the group a little bit about sort of you're down there in Miami, but a little bit about sort of where directives come from. We'll talk about, of course, the Argo in a little bit, but just a little bit about the group, if you can inform us a little bit more about it within the overall NOAA system.
Sure. Yeah. Within NOAA, you mentioned that we have 7 different laboratories, and AOML, situated down here in Miami, is charged with kind of overseeing research broadly across the Atlantic Ocean basin, the Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico. And so we have 3 different divisions that make up our laboratory: the Hurricane Research Division, the Physical Oceanography Division, and the division that I work for, Ocean Chemistry and Ecosystems Division. And even down at kind of my Ocean Chemistry and Ecosystems Division level, we have just a huge breadth of research that's happening across our little kind of sector of the lab. So we, as you mentioned, have researchers that look at the global carbon budget, the way that the ocean is absorbing CO2, where that CO2 and carbon are being distributed across the entire ocean. We have a group that focuses on coral health, and they're looking at coral reefs across the Caribbean with a large focus on the Florida Keys. We have a lot of kind of local kind of initiatives looking at Biscayne Bay, Port Everglades, and the health of ecosystems in our immediate region. And the work that I have come into doing is really focused on biogeochemistry across the Gulf of Mexico. And I should also mention kind of an emerging, it's relatively well established, but it continues to grow, area of research that our division is carrying out is using omics technology. So this is using environmental DNA and applying that to different kind of ocean research questions. But we are part of the federal government. We have a mandate from our agency, kind of a list of directives of the type of research that we carry out. And so all of the work that I've described that's happening across our division and lab is all responsive to questions that are relevant for the citizens of the United States. So we're responding to kind of needs of the government. And
Excellent. Really excellent. So you are one of the principal investigators of the biogeochemical Argo program. I believe that sits within a broader NOAA Argo program. And I was, I was watching you. It was actually recently. It was let's see, the United States Integrated Ocean Observing Systems Symposia, Gulf of Mexico regional component of that, where you were giving a presentation on the program, and you put up this really cool map of the world. It basically, it looked like you could walk across the oceans with all the sensors that you have out there. But at the time, this was January 16th of this year, you had 3,931 out there. Talk about this program, sort of the genesis of it initially. I mean, these sensors that you have out there collecting data from sea surface to 2,000 meters, and it's not just, you're taking in measurements of temperature and salinity and various chemicals and oxygenation, acidification. You're studying everything. I mean, you're getting such an amazing data set here. Walk us through this, because I think this is really, really fascinating.
Yeah, so the Argo program came to be in the early 90s. So it's been around for my entire life, and maybe a little bit more, as it was kind of envisioned starting in the late 80s. And it is a program that is internationally supported. So there are many, many different countries that contribute to this what we call a global Argo array. And so, as you mentioned, at any given time, there are about 4,000 of these robotic ocean profiling floats that are in the ocean at any given time. The United States, through NOAA, supports about 50% of the global Argo array. So about 2,000 of those floats come from US dollars that are supporting this observing system. Historically, starting in the 90s up until maybe a decade or so ago, the program has been dominantly using profiling floats that have measured temperature and salinity. The main kind of motivator for the program initially was to observe changes in ocean temperature, changes in sea level rise as a result of oceans warming. Thermal expansion is happening as the ocean heats up, and it physically causes some degree of sea level rise. And so after several decades of success with launching this Argo program, finding different partners and countries, and truly making an international kind of collaboration, as the data are all freely available immediately when they come in to the system. The array grew, it hit 4,000 floats. It's been sustained for some time, and there was a vision that we could expand out the mission of observing temperature and salinity across the global ocean to add biogeochemistry. And I do want to kind of pause before I launch into biogeochemistry to talk about the importance of the Argo array to our understanding of global climate change has been critical. It has been the main observing system that has kind of facilitated our kind of big picture global view of how the oceans have warmed across not only the surface, which satellite observations can give us a sense of sea surface temperature changes, but in the subsurface.
Sure.
And it has been instrumental in observing and kind of building out this massive data set that's helped us to understand sea level rise as well. So adding biogeochemistry allows us to create, again, this synoptic view of what's happening across the global ocean. The map that you described with 4,000 floats, it kind of reminds me, if you've seen a map of planes traveling across the United States, it looks like that. You just look like you have planes that would be running into one another. They're just so dense, but the floats are actually pretty far apart from one another. The ocean is a big wide space. And so the technology itself is really incredible. It's battery operated. So we load them up with lithium batteries, and they're designed to operate for 5, 6, sometimes as long as 7 years. So we launch them, and they continue to provide data to us over the course of their lifetime. They are spending a lot of their time drifting at about 1,000 meters down in the water column. So they're kind of hanging out. There's no motor in the float. We're not driving them. They're just drifting with ocean currents. Once every 10 days, the float activates, sinks all the way down to 2,000 meters, turns on its sensor package, and collects data as it drifts all the way up to the surface. It takes about 7 hours just for the float to get from 2,000 meters to the surface. And once it gets up to the surface, it has an antenna that emerges, and the data, there's a SIM card in the float, and it calls us through the Iridium satellite array. So there's a network of satellites that are covering the globe at any time, any place. There's 66 of them that are distributed across the globe. And so it's pinging to the closest satellite a call that has our data packaged up in it. And that call then reaches us at AOML, at our servers. And so I could be sitting at my desk and pulling up ocean data from the middle of the Gulf of Mexico within the span of an hour of the profile being collected. And as I mentioned, the data system that's set up for Argo makes all the data freely available to anyone that wants to use it at any given time. You have to have a little bit of knowledge and skill to know how to navigate a NetCDF file, but the data are also packaged up and sent to what's called the Global Telecommunication System, or the GTS. And that way, operational forecasts, weather forecasts, are using Argo data as it comes into the GTS immediately. So our day-to-day forecasts, our hurricane, extreme weather forecasts are all informed by this important ocean data that the Argo array is supplying in near real time.
You know, it's interesting because, you know, you have published this work. Yeah, obviously, in your PhD, you're studying the California coast. You're heavily focused on the Gulf now. But one of your prior roles, interesting, was as Arctic research manager, and you had some publications looking at these dynamics as well in the Arctic Ocean. Can you tell us a little bit, because obviously the Argo floats are everywhere, including the Arctic. Any interesting learnings about, when you study these complex biogeochemical, targets? Any interesting findings per the differences between what's happening in I think of the Gulf as very, obviously warm water and lots of reefs and fish and everything else. I'm not sure what's up in the Arctic, but I know there's life up there also. Talk a little bit about some of sort of the differences that you see when you study these different regions.
Yeah, sure. Every system that I've worked in has been quite distinct from one another. So I started in the California current ecosystem, which is what we call an eastern boundary upwelling system, where we have this strong seasonal upwelling occurring, which makes the west coast of the United States incredibly productive in terms of how many nutrients are there, and vibrant in terms of the ecosystems. It also means that we have a lot more carbon that's naturally introduced to that system. So in that particular area, the work that I was doing was focusing on the top-down stress that we have from ocean acidification and anthropogenic CO2, as well as the bottom-up stress of natural upwelling processes that are bringing these naturally carbon-rich waters to the surface, and how that intersects. So that was a lot of the work that I was focusing on there. In the Arctic Ocean, which was the next kind of chapter of my work, where I took a little bit of a sidestep from working in a research kind of laboratory space, and I was working in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years in kind of a program management capacity. And when I was doing that, I worked with the Arctic Research Program as well as the Ocean Acidification Research Program. And within the Arctic Research Program, I had the opportunity to work on a climate assessment that NOAA puts out every year called the Arctic Report Card. And the Arctic Report Card gives us kind of a year snapshot pulse on the state of the Arctic environment. And so the things that communities living up in the Arctic are contending with are just incredible in terms of the climate impacts that they are already facing there. So they have not only warming oceans and ocean acidification, but they have melting permafrost that is destabilizing the ground that their homes are on. They have a massive reduction in sea ice, and a loss of sea ice sometimes means that during the stormiest times of year, they might have an ice buffer that's typically along the coast and it's not there anymore. So they have much kind of stormier weather to contend with. And so there are so many stressors that exist in the Arctic, and so many different intersecting issues that are occurring there. And this kind of incredible issue of Indigenous communities and the need to connect with them and use their institutional kind of knowledge to co-produce knowledge and information moving forward, and trying to understand climate change in the Arctic. It's really, really difficult to work in the Arctic. As you might imagine, it's a really harsh environment. There are many times where it's just not accessible for us to get there by ship. So a lot of the work that we're able to do in terms of oceanography is in the summer into the early kind of fall months. And so there's a big chunk of the year where we don't have observations. And there actually aren't very many Argo floats in the Arctic because of the sea ice. And it makes it literally, the sea ice will crush technology that we try to leave up there over the summer. So it's a place where we need all the help that we are able to get to expand out the observations that we have. And then in the Gulf of Mexico, just in the last 2 years that I've been focusing my attention in the Gulf, it too is a place that has many different factors that it's influenced by. So we have this really incredible current system that moves through the Gulf of Mexico that's called the Loop Current. As it passes along Florida, once it leaves the Gulf, it becomes what we know as the Gulf Stream. And so it is just a super rapid moving current that's passing through, that's bringing its own kind of biogeochemical signal to the basin. It's shedding these physical features that are called eddies. We have the Mississippi River, as well as numerous other rivers, which provide input into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's delivering lots of fresh water, but nutrients as well as pollutants into the Gulf. So we have this really kind of predictable, or I should say maybe reliable development of a hypoxia zone, which is a zone where we have very, very low oxygen concentrations.
Okay.
That happens every year in the northern Gulf of Mexico as a result of water flushing out of the Mississippi River, having excess nutrients from all the farmland that are being transported through those river waters into the basin. And the way that that causes algal blooms, which are then kind of, they die and the algae break down. And through that breakdown process, they consume oxygen. And so we're left with these hypoxic zones. We also have lots of harmful algal blooms in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's something else that we're contending with. So the ocean has many different variables and many different things that are going on. But we do kind of, when we are able to get these long enough records, which tools like FORAMs and paleoceanography can really help us to build longer term records, we do see that kind of this overprinted signal of climate change and ocean acidification is oftentimes the biggest signal that we see when we look back through time, particularly in our open ocean regions where we have a bit more stability and a bit less variability from what's happening along the coastlines.
Well, you mentioned before about using omics tools in your studies. What else in sort of the evolving technology toolkit, whether it's artificial intelligence or computer vision or whatever the next cool thing is, are you sort of integrating in this package in terms of, because obviously you're generating a tremendous amount of data on all these factors within all the sensors. Tell us a little bit about sort of technology's role here and allowing you to execute on this pretty broad mission.
Yeah, technology, I feel, has opened so many doors and allowed us to answer so many questions scientifically. But as we get more information, we always have more questions. And so with the technology that we have access to today, we're able to ask questions that researchers 10, 20, 30 years ago would have never probably dreamt of being able to ask and answer. So you've mentioned omics as something that falls within that category in terms of technologies and new kind of analytical advances that have been made. So we're taking environmental DNA. So this is essentially eDNA is a word that describes any DNA remnants that we find in the environment. So I think a simple example is if you have a whale that passes through a particular part of the ocean, if you collect a water sample where that whale had just passed through, it's shed DNA. And so you should be able to detect that whale's DNA in your water sample that you've collected. So there's really endless opportunities to biologically kind of characterize new parts of the environment that we haven't been able to before.
And continuing along that, you because you rang the bell there for a minute, because one I come out of the pharmaceutical industry, and our industry was heavily based for the past 100 years on bioactive substances derived from maybe plants, fungi, bacteria, mainly terrestrial. I think the really smart people will tell you that we've only scratched the surface with what's under the water. And I was just interested, sort of I don't know if it falls within your group or maybe another group at NOAA, but per that omics technology and what you're able to screen, um, any interesting sort of bioprospecting related initiatives, maybe not within NOAA, but partnerships or anything like that? Because, whether it's new drugs or industrial enzymes or whatever, there's probably a lot of sort of natural knowledge that we've still not unlocked in the oceans. Anything interesting on that front at all?
Yeah, for sure. That is outside of my particular wheelhouse, but there is a program within NOAA that's called Ocean Exploration Research, or OER, and
Okay,
they have an OMIX program, and their program is really rooted in exploring the unknown of the ocean.
got it.
And so they are doing just that. That kind of bioprospecting is an element of the work that they carry out.
Neat, neat. Um, Coming back to the Argo for a moment, there was a press release on the NOAA website. I think it was like last week or so, and it was about something called the Go Ship cruise. It's standing for Global Oceanic Ship-Based Hydrographic Investigations Program. Again, so they're taking a cruise from, I think, Brazil to Reykjavik, Iceland, or something like that, and their Argo is going to be a part of that, or sort of their work. Are you getting out on any? I mean, obviously, nice being in Miami, but are you getting out, sort of cruising around when it comes to the Argo program, whether you have to investigate sensors that are malfunctioning or deploying new ones, or other cool things that you may be doing going back to the Arctic? Anything neat with these cruises that you're involved in?
Sure. Yeah, the Go Ship program is a program that has historically been really central to the success of the Argo program, because it is a platform, or kind of a ride for us to catch to get out into the middle of the ocean where many ships don't go, and drop off these Argo floats so they can start doing their work. Partnering with ships of opportunity like the Go Ship program to deploy Argo floats also means that when we put the float in the water, that we can collect water samples at the same location we drop the float.
Mm,
When we put the float in, it's programmed, it's been calibrated. The data are pretty good that are coming in for the most part, but having data that's collected by scientists analyzed in the lab allows us to kind of do a comparison, to just do a gut check and to make corrections to the data, to bring them up to the kind of the same quality level. Because Go Ship collected water samples are kind of like the gold standard for the best quality in terms of carbonate chemistry or oxygen, or kind of all the things that the BGC floats are measuring with these tiny little sensor packages. There are entire labs on ships that are dedicated with people around the clock analyzing these samples. So it's been a really important partnership. I sailed on another NOAA ship, or a NOAA cruise, the same ship that you described that's operating Go Ship. It's called the Ronald Brown.
okay.
And the Brown went out into the Gulf of Mexico in late 2021. So that was a cruise that I caught a ride on. It was a 40-day cruise. It went all
Mm.
around the Gulf of Mexico. And I say cruise, and it sounds like we're on a Carnival cruise ship, but it's hard work. So we typically are working in 12-hour shifts. And it's around the clock science for the most part. There are some days where we're transiting from one station to another, and it might be a day or two, but often we're back to back at stations. And when you're on station, you're doing work. So I think the first Argo float that I launched was about 4 in the morning, and it was a success and exciting to get the first float out there in the Gulf. Um, and definitely an exciting environment to be on a research ship with so many different kind of research questions and projects and samples that are being collected.
Outstanding. Really awesome. Well, aside from, your clear passion towards this research program and obviously lecturing on these topics, one of the things that you are also very focused on is inspiring that next generation. We hope to do the same thing with our show in terms of STEM, in terms of the folks that are thinking about what's next in their future, graduating high school, just starting out in college, and thinking about these global issues, where it's going to take them. Say a few words about sort of your own STEM initiatives. I don't know if you have programs or high school students that come by and check out what you're doing at NOAA, but just say a few words about what's happening on the STEM front in terms of that next generation of thought leaders that we all hope will get interested in joining you at NOAA and continuing these types of programs in the future.
Yeah, that's something that really made me successful, made me kind of take the next step in science, was the mentorship that I got during my undergraduate experience and then continued on. And I had an excellent graduate mentor. And so mentorship is something that has been really a key to me, honestly, reaching a level in my career that I would have never expected as a young person. I never really thought that I would be a scientist when I was an elementary, middle, high schooler, and that mentorship and encouragement and having folks that really kind of believed in me at times more than I did was what helped me take that next step. And so I really value that a lot, and I try to kind of pay it forward, pay it back by mentoring really anyone that I have the opportunity to. So even just recently, I got an email from a young woman who is in 12th grade in Australia, and she is going out to her beach and collecting some sand, and she's going to send it to me, and we're going to look at forams together.
Awesome.
I have students that I am working with at AOML, at the master's, PhD, and postgraduate level. When I went out on the research cruise in the Gulf of Mexico, I had connected with 4 different universities because we were launching 4 different Argo floats. So I had kind of started this NOAA Adopt a Float type program, and I was really targeting universities that aren't heavily involved in the Argo program in this kind of oceanographic research. So I connected with HBCUs, with kind of marginalized serving universities and colleges to bring those students in. And although it was kind of during the thick of COVID and it was difficult to have any sort of in-person experiences,
Sure.
we had this fun exchange. At least it was fun for me. I hope it was fun for them. They said that it was. Where the students, I connected with them before I went to sea, gave a lecture, and I sent them a stack of styrofoam cups. So like a cup you would get at a fast food restaurant. They were just white cups. And I asked them to use some Sharpies that I had also sent them to decorate the cups. And this is kind of a age-old traditions of oceanographers where you take these styrofoam cups, which you've decorated, drawn maybe pictures of whatever research thing you're interested in. So I had a BGC float on one of them, kind of a picture of what the research ship looks like. Someone also sent me a cookout styrofoam cup to send down. But when I was on the ship itself, I put the cups in a laundry bag, kind of one of those mesh laundry bags, and I connected it to an instrument that we sent down 3,000 meters in the ocean. And so when those cups come back up, they are just incredibly compressed and tiny. They're probably maybe a sixth of the size, just because of the sheer pressure that the ocean exerts on them. And so when I got back, I was able to ship those cups back to the students so they could have something that was connecting them to that cruise and to where the float, the depths of the ocean that the float is able to go.
Excellent. Really excellent. Um, Emily, I was reading that just back in the end of January, your team attended the at Scripps Institute. They had the annual ocean acidification community meeting, and a variety of topics were presented there. What else is happening in terms of sort of public-facing initiatives per your group? For 2023? Any upcoming meetings, conferences, places that we may run into you, listen to you, meet you? Anything else on the calendar that you want to highlight? Please have the floor.
So something else that I am working on with a huge team of researchers across the US is the 5th National Climate Assessment. And so this is something that the US government has mandated has to be published once every 4 years. And it's a comprehensive checkup on how things are going in terms of Earth's climate. So we have dozens and dozens of chapters. There are hundreds of authors that contribute, and all of them are kind of focusing on their subject matter expertise. The chapter that I've been involved with is the Oceans and Marine Resources chapter. So we're kind of giving a 4-year update on what's the latest that we know and understand. And also, what are the research gaps that still remain with respect to how our oceans are changing, and specifically how our changing oceans affects our resources. So these are things like fisheries, ecotourism, and the decisions that we make today in terms of how we mitigate our carbon dioxide emissions or take kind of active approaches to draw down CO2, store CO2 in other places using carbon dioxide removal technologies, kind of how these decisions today will impact us tomorrow. So that should be coming out later this year in 2023. It's the 5th National Climate Assessment, authoritative resource on the latest with respect to climate change.
It is a really fascinating set of research initiatives. Obviously, so timely and relevant to what we as a planet are going through in 2023. And I just really wish you, Emily, and your team the best with all of this and what you continue to learn from studying the oceans all around us. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this particular episode of our podcast on the various podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel. Again, you've been listening to Dr. Emily Osborne, research scientist within the Ocean Chemistry and Ecosystems Division, Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory, part of NOAA. Emily, I want to thank you again for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us for a little while, educate us on these themes. Obviously, thank you for what you're doing for the globe. And as we like to say here on our show, thanks again for helping to create a better tomorrow via the research you and your team are doing. It's really a very fascinating story.
Thanks so much, Ira.